Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Q2 launch, and this session is about easily integrating your platforms with Skillable. My name is Eric Rao, and I am the Lab Delivery Product Manager, and I'd like to welcome to this session, talk about APIs, and to hopefully when you leave, you'll have a better understanding how to integrate with our products. So let's give just a brief introduction as to our agenda. And before I begin, just bear in mind this session is being recorded, so please be advised to that. And also make sure we're not sharing any of this information. So just be careful when we actually have our Q&A session, and we'll all be great. Any questions you have, please post them in the chat session. And I have two of our great Skillable staff monitoring the queue in order to make sure that things get addressed and dealt with. And if there are any questions where you just want to interrupt me, if you just want to either raise your hand or something, and within the Teams channel, and I'll pause. And but we do have a definite Q&A process or Q&A session at the end. So just to give you the idea of where we're starting, okay, quick introduction of our agenda today. We are going to talk about how we integrate with our two main products, our Lab on Demand and our training management system, and what are different ways that an LMS can connect to us. And then if we want to unlock the full potential of over 100 of our API commands, what do we need? And that is when we start talking about what an API is, how to use the API, what standards are used within the API, and why do we need standards? And then we're going to talk a little bit further and actually do a demo of Skillable Connect. I know Frank in his opening keynote actually gave just a brief overview, but we're going to get a little bit more in depth and be able to leave this session. And I'm hoping that when everyone leaves this session, you'll be able to dive right in yourself and be more productive and be more aware of actually how to use which API and what's needed to be successful for integration. And then lastly, we're going to talk about some typical use cases when thinking about APIs, what those use cases are, how that applies to us, and then we'll finish the session with a demo of actually using both the LOD APIs and also the TMS APIs. And then we'll end our session with a Q&A period. So if I begin, what are two ways of actually interacting and integrating systems with our products, interacting with Skillable? Well, here at Skillable, we want to make interacting with our Lab on Demand or our LOD and our training management system, the TMS products, much simpler. We understand that business users want to solve specific problems and retrieve the services and data needed to resolve those problems. Integration must always be in a standards-based, must be well-defined, straightforward, and ultimately easy to use to be able to exchange data and services. Looking at the two diagrams that we have right now, if you notice the one on the left, so if you are an LMS user, so you have a learning management system and you want to connect to Skillable, to launch a lab, to be able to receive grades or something like that. And if you, in the LMS, are able to use an open standard for learning tools interoperability, which is LTI, we support version 1.3. And in the keynote, we also support the legacy version 1.1. We'll go into that a little bit more in detail a little bit later when we get to LTI specific. But just to give you the rough idea of actually how this works, so basically it's a single sign-on, and the LMS initiates the call to the Skillable LOD platform. It launches the particular lab, and the way that LTI works within the LMS, it's set up as an external tool. So there's some configuration that you will need to do in your LMS to actually give us the right parameters and URLs to redirect to, and vice versa in LOD, we also then return that back to you. And once that interconnection has been configured, then it's just a matter of adding more courses in your LMS, launching to specific labs to retrieve your grading data. But if you are looking for more than just grading data, if you want to basically unlock the full data set that is captured within your labs and in the whole Skillable ecosystem, then we start talking about what we see on the right-hand side. Then we use our RESTful APIs. And our APIs is basically a way to expose commands and operations used to actually interact with our two products. And so typically, if your LMS does not support LTI, you say, well, how can I connect? Well, then we have the ability to connect directly through our APIs, as well as if you want more data to be returned, obviously, it's going to be something you want to drill into more on the API side. LTI, bear in mind, is only just a subset of the data that you retrieve. However, getting full reporting capabilities, so if you're interested in reporting, and if you have enough time in the session, I'll actually show you a demo also on how to use our APIs for reporting. It's a wonderful opportunity for you to actually sort of drill down more and understand how to actually retrieve the information in a very intelligible way and very straightforward. You can say, well, what is an API? And what do I need them for? And if you may or may not have been involved with API integrations in the past, and if you're new on this call to APIs, basically, it's when you think of it, software needs to communicate with each other, and the application programming interface, or short-formed API, is kind of an intermediary that exposes the commands and operations to follow allows remote functionality in a more programmatic way. So a lot of times you send a request in and the receiving end performs some sort of action, returns a result, returns something, and a lot of times it's back and forth negotiation that actually mimics and walks through an actual use case or a workflow, an API workflow that actually will get you to the expected result. So it really helps and assists developers in creating the integrations in a well-defined, if the API has a well-defined documentation portal that provides detailed instructions of actually how each API command is used, when to use it. Also, it would demonstrate and reveal what results would be returned. So if we take a look at the right at this diagram, just a very simple description of how an API fundamentally works. So as a simple user case is when the user clicks on a lab button, and the lab button would be exposed in the customer's LMS. So typically you would create a course and it would expose a connection, and it would initiate a call out to the Skillable API. So the LMS would send a request to the Skillable API to launch a lab. And then once the lab is launched, it actually goes through this verification. Well, it goes through the verification process first, which a security key is provided in that request. And you can see down here in the second area. So here is where the request is made. The third area is where we're actually validating based on a security mechanism, which we have as API key, which is unique and assigned to each customer. And the Skillable platform, in this case LOD, will authenticate the request, and upon validation passes the information along to the actual platform and database to actually serve or launch that particular lab. The user then, what will happen is a message will be sent back to the LMS with the URL to launch to open the lab for the user. And all that interaction is done through several commands, which we'll show in our demo of actually how this workflow works. So pretty straightforward. Launch your request, gets authenticated, The results are then returned back, and if there are any errors along the way, all of that is exposed through the API response, at which point the LMS would be able to pick that up and expose those to the actual user. So you can say, well, what is Skillable Connect anyways? Well, integration with hands-on skilling and retrieving the rich data, where and when we need to use it, and why Skillable Connect is the perfect tool. Well, these are some of the things that Frank opened up with in his keynote. Well, the tool, Skillable Connect, it simplifies the process by presenting hands-on labs commands, or by exposing API commands in a very organized and straightforward fashion. And it allows you to find which particular API command is needed and at what point in time. So many times it's hard to also understand, well, what commands do I need and how do I interact? Do I need one command? Do I need two commands? Well, that's where we want to integrate and standardize more on open standards. So when exposing APIs, we at Skillable have standardized on our Open API standard. And it's a standard-based method to leverage our APIs. It's fully compliant with the Open API initiative, as Frank has indicated in his opening keynote. And what's also important in this particular launch of Connect, which launched May 5th, so just not quite a month ago, what was exposed is the fact that all of our APIs commands now are grouped and organized logically. And we'll go through that in just a moment when we get to the demo. But why that's important is it's organized in typically the way that your workflow would work, where before we launched Skillable Connect, we exposed our all of our over 100 API commands. They weren't organized, they were just done in alphabetical order. And so in this case, what we've done is we've brought it together, utilized an Open API standard. Why the Open API standard is used, we'll get into in just a moment, but it now allows us to make things a little bit easier to use. And soon to be released, coming in just a few weeks, will be the self-serve testing tools, which we can perform and test our API calls directly from within the Skillable Connect product. And that's going to be a game changer. So not only can you look at the API documentation, you're able to actually initiate the calls from within the actual API portal itself. And the wonderful thing about that is that not only can you initiate the testing, you can also check against part of the standard. We expose and put in example responses. So based on certain use cases. So sometimes you say, well, what would happen if I launch a lab and I used an invalid parameter? What if I tried to launch something that didn't exist? What kind of response would I get back from the API? So the Open API standard, we're adding more and more examples as we go along of different use cases that customers actually are having challenges with to make the documentation more vibrant and more active. And what I want to continue is we talked about standards and why we use standards and what they're designed for. Well, the Open API standard is used to describe our REST APIs, and it allows us to declare our API security method. So how is it? So a lot of times when connecting up to API vendors, sometimes it becomes challenging to say, well, how do I connect? How do I initiate my first call? How difficult is that? Well, part of that Open API standard is we expose all of that information right at the top, right in the definition. And we'll demo that as soon as we get to our demo. We declare all of the commands, their endpoints, the responses. Also, we expose and document all of the HTTP status messages that are supported. So you get a full set of documentation at your fingertips around the command that you're actually of interest. So which is fantastic. We'll show you how that works and what some of these some of the benefits are. Also, using the Open API standard also assists with the design, the development, and implementation phase. So a lot of times when you are faced with, I have this LMS and I need to connect with Skillable, with their products. How do I do that? Where do I begin? I wish I could just test the APIs. Maybe I can just test some sample calls. Maybe I create a lab in Lab on Demand and I publish it, and I want to be able to launch it from an API. How difficult is that? Well, we're going to go through all that in our demo. So it's going to be able to, you're going to be able to see, notice, and see how easy it is to integrate with our platform and our products. As we mentioned earlier, we have two methods to communicate and interact with our platform. And the one method we talked about earlier was the LTI, the Learning Tools Interoperability. And it's a standard-based implementation for learning platform integration. So many LMSs will support different learning platform integration standards. One of the major ones is LTI, and Skillable standardized on LTI early on. And LTI has different versions. And so what Frank mentioned in the opening keynote is that the IMS Global, which is the consortium, basically has a deprecation schedule for any old versions. So they will no longer, those protocols will no longer be certified within your LMS or anything, but it doesn't mean that the protocol stops. We at Skillable will still continue to support that standard 1.1, but we advise all of our customers, if you want to stay on LTI, what are some of the things that I can do? Well, I can upgrade to LTI 1.3. And our support staff will be more than happy and willing to assist you in that process. However, if you want to actually dive in a little bit more, you may also want to start considering some of our API integration. But getting back to LTI, as you look at this the slide, and you see the Lab on Demand and the training management system. So in the Lab on Demand, okay, so we support version 1.1 and 1.3, and it allows us to easily integrate with our labs. So when would you use this? You would use this if you wanted to be able to connect and launch a lab from your LMS, receive the results from a score or from an exam, or if you just have activities and want to get detailed activity reporting back into the LMS. So that's all exposed through LTI 1.3 with the with deep linking and also LTI Advantage. So some of those protocols are built into that 1.3 standard. If you still stayed on 1.1, you wouldn't have all that detail. All you would have is just the score. You'd be able to launch and get the score. So obviously moving to a later standard like 1.3 is always preferable. And you notice that the way it works within the LMS is the LMS is always considered as the platform, and the external tool, and in this case it would be Skillable Lab on Demand, okay, would be the external tool. So the LTI protocol would say, go to the external tool, request this particular lab, run this lab for this user, automatically log them in, have interaction back and forth, and once the user finishes that lab and submits it for scoring, those results are scored in the tool. So in Skillable LOD, we would actually we would complete that score and send it back to the LMS. So in that case, all that interaction is done. Now in the training management system, so if you're a user that uses our training management system, which is a wonderful LMS, and let's say you have some external LTI content that you want to bring in. Well, we also support that. So in this case, you see that the roles are reversed. So in this case, the platform is the actual TMS itself, And then we call the external tool LTI tool, or some provider that actually has content via LTI that we can actually pull in. And then where would that be exposed? That would be exposed in a course. I can add an activity to that course to be able to say, this is an external LTI resource that I need to pull information on. So just to give you the rough idea of what LTI is and where we use that. So moving forward, and just before our first demo, we're going to talk briefly about our different API models. So there are two Skillable API data models that are fully documented within Skillable Connect. So it's a Skillable Connect TMS edition and the Skillable Connect LOD edition. The Skillable Connect TMS edition, or the training management system, okay, what does it expose? Well, the API, remember I mentioned there's over 100 commands between both of the APIs, both TMS and LOD, that exposes so much of the learning ecosystem, either on the labs or on the TMS. So if we're on the TMS, it'd be a place where you could administer your user accounts within TMS. So let's say I'm a large organization, I import 1,000 users, and now I need to update their information. How do I do that effectively? I'm not going to log into the TMS as an administrator and go through each one of them if I have 500 to update. So in that case, APIs would be a way of doing that, a simple way of doing that, and we could very easily do that. And we're going to actually show that in our later demo. Has powerful searching capabilities for retrieving information on course material. We can manage enrollments all through the API. So we can also not only manage enrollments for within classes, we can also create course assignments. So if we have our users, we can already assign them training. We can assign them and add them into a specific subscription. So if we put all of our courses in a subscription, now if I have those users active within the TMS, I now through an API call can actually assign them the right subscription. I can assign them the right group of courses. So now all of a sudden for a large enterprise, it becomes a lot more flexible to do everything rather than having an administrator at the other end of the call saying, I have to do 300 of these updates today. It's going to take me a couple of days, but through the API, all these functions are exposed and given. For the LOD, we have the ability to interact with our lab instances, launch labs, resume them. We can initiate scoring, retrieve scoring results. We can manage our lab profiles, get information on our lab profiles, and we can also administer user accounts and also launch lab profiles for large events, and we can retrieve evaluation responses. So I'm going to take a brief now segue, and we're going to actually do our first demo into Skillable Connect. Okay. I had it open, and just bear with me a second. There we go. Okay, so our Skillable Connect. So connect.skillable.com. So if we go to connect.skillable.com, it lands us on the default landing page of the LOD edition. And some things that you will notice. So what I want to show is the fact that we now have a 3-panel design. So the 3-panel design allows us to keep focused right away at the right information. So API developers typically, when you're looking at developing, most of the time you say, let me see what the result looks like to know if that's the right command. Because sometimes you say, I don't know what command to pick, but you go through the results. So how do we do that? So you see here on the left-hand side, this is where we talked about the grouping mechanism. So all of our commands are grouped into logical segments. So if I'm dealing just with labs themselves, so a lab instance launching, resuming, canceling, saving, getting results from a lab, all of that is done under the lab instance management. So if I click on this, you'll see that right away you have all the labs, all the commands in the order that you typically would actually consume them. So typically launch in the lab. You may cancel a lab depending if it was launched incorrectly. Retrieving results of that specific instance that you just launched. And then I want to get the results after the user had completed it. Maybe I want to save the instance. Maybe I want to resume the lab. So there's many different things that I can do. Or maybe I want to send a notification out to that lab user and just say, hey, I'm going to post a message out. So all of these things are very useful to know that you have this design. And what I mentioned is API developers like to have the result also being visible at the same time. So the nice thing is, if I don't understand what the groupings mean, at the top of each group, you'll see that there is a short description to give you the rough idea of what's composed in there. So a lot of times you say, I want to do something about launching a lab. Great, I'm in the right area. And you'll see that the way it's set up, that we have on the right-hand side in the panel, we have the sample response. So what would that mean? It's saying, hey, if I were to run this command, and this is what a typical response would be that I get back. And you'd see right away that I would have the URL to the lab that gets launched. I would have a lab instance ID, and it actually would tell me the expiry. And if I had any errors, I'd get some sort of errors. So what you notice in the middle is the actual details of the actual command. So if I scroll down, you see that here that the authorization, as I mentioned before, the authorization, what does that mean? Well, that means the API key. Where should it be? It should be as a header parameter in your call when you're calling via the API. Come back to here, you would see that not only do we have the actual query parameters, we actually show, it's very easily highlighted which ones are required. We also have examples of actually what the data element should be within that particular object, as well as we indicate if it's integer, if it's string. So it gives you a very good understanding for how to make the right call. And lastly, as you notice that below each of these commands, we have what's called the response section. So if I come and take a look at this response example here, okay, what you'll also see that we have all of the information that would be returned. So I had a 1 for success. Right, but what if it errored out? How do I know what was happening? So there's many different status messages that actually could come back, and so this way it gives a very good use of that 3-panel design. Just always keep the user in line with the actual result itself. And if I wanted to cancel a lab, well, sometimes we have, or I mentioned there's different example responses we can have depending on the different status. So if you notice that on the right-hand side, that we also have an example of a successful response, example of, hey, something errored out. So let's say I tried to cancel a lab and I didn't have the right API key, the right integration key. So maybe I have multiple keys for different organizations. I'm a large vendor and I have maybe different configurations, and I use the wrong API key to cancel a lab in one particular of my sub-organizations. So in this case, it would say, hey, you have something invalid. So it gives you the rough idea of actually how that actually is used. And last, what I wanted to show you in this quick demo, and that is we have a powerful search engine that's also built in. So if I wanted to find something about just a result, okay, something about the results. So now you can actually say, okay, returner information have been started, return information about a lab instance or a result. Okay, that's the one I want to see. I want to get information on a lab that was just launched, and I want to be able to see the result. And right away, I say, yes, this is what I want to see. I want to see the result. I want to see, did they pass? Did they fail? So you can see on the right-hand side, it helps us actually identify the right command by having a built-in search. All of this is all new as of last for the Skillable Connect launch. And Coming back to our PowerPoint, we just have a couple slides, and we'll go into an active demo of actually using, just bear with me, I think I went. Okay, so looking at typical use cases for our connection with LOD. So if I wanted to launch labs, so typically, here's a typical use case. You launch a lab, I save a lab, I resume a lab. Okay, so that's a very typical use case from an LMS. So maybe I want to say, I want to give the user the ability, rather than just doing a one-off launch, maybe I want to be able to allow them to save it. They have up to X amount of days to resume that lab. So maybe it's a lab from day 1 to day 2, and they come back in day 2, they want to resume the lab that they just saved from the day before. So this use case, where would I find that? And you can see here, I've actually listed where in the documentation you would find, or what grouping you would find. So I'm just going to go through these a little bit quickly so we can get to our demo, and then we'll get to our Q&A session. So launching a lab, okay. So in this case, if I'm dealing with getting more results, okay, results from a lab, so I may just launch it, get details of a lab. How's the student working? Have they saved the lab yet? Have they submitted it for scoring yet? How do I know that? Or they left the class and they forgot to save their or submit for scoring. So now all of a sudden, that results may not be processed. So in that case, you'd run a command and say, let me check the details of that lab, and let me get the results from that particular instance. Another thing you could do is, let's say you want to modify instructions within a lab. You can do that through the API. I can actually update. I can retrieve the information. I can actually update the instructions. So all of that's done and exposed to the API. So which is a wonderful use case if you wanted to expose an instruction panel within your LMS just to have outside of the lab experience itself. And lastly, and these are just a few of the typical use cases. Let's say I wanted to actually run a class from LOD. Well, I could create a class, and within that class, you would specify a group of lab profiles or a group of labs that you can launch. And then it would retrieve a class access URL, at which point you'd be able to monitor all the labs that are launched by users within the class. And then at the end, you could actually clean up and delete that class. If we go over to the TMS, just as a simple segue into here. So here we can also, as I mentioned earlier, if let's say you're a large organization, you have thousands of users within the TMS, all consuming content and courses, and you need to either create users, update users, retrieve their information. That's all revolved around the user management process. Well, we can actually get further, and let's say, hey, I have the catalog of courses there. I want to expose through my API. I want to be able to do a catalog call. I want to be able to expose what's available, what's there, and provide some sort of information on these courses and provide feedback. We can also, work with enrollments. So let's say we have classes and we're enrolling our students. Very easily here, as you can see, there's many different use cases. These are just typical use cases. Each of these green boxes would be a specific API call. So as an example, in the top left here, you can see create user, retrieve user, update user. Those would be 3 individual API calls, just to give you the concept of actually how this works. And that's why having the documentation in the order that you typically would consume it is actually very powerful. It helps in actually determining how this actually works. So what I'm going to do next is go into an actual live demo of actually running through our APIs to do both LOD and TMS. And before I continue, are there any questions in the chat? I don't see any. Okay, so I'll let me continue. And so typically when we're integrating, we need to have some tools to actually connect with. So what I'm going to do is at the top of our API. So if you go just to Skillable Connect and we come up to the top, you notice that we also have the ability, okay, to download the specification. Okay, so download the specification. I've already done that, and I'm going to use a tool, and I've just imported it into Postman. So Postman, Insomnia, a couple of integration tools, and you can see all I did before our session today, all I did is downloaded it, and I imported it directly, and I added in the API key. So once you have the API key added in, now all of these commands, this is through Postman, are made available. And so let me just run through a typical use case. And in this case, let's say we want to launch a lab. So I'm in the LMS or I'm in some remote system, and I say, how do I launch lab? How do I save it? How do I resume it? How do I retrieve information on it? And how do I go through that process? If I come quickly back to our documentation, okay, so that's all in the lab instance management. So launching a lab, oh, it'll probably be this command. I want to be able to save a lab. That's down here. I want to resume a lab. Oh, that's down here. What if I want to retrieve results or details about that particular lab itself that's running? That's up here. What if I submitted the score? How would I get the scoring results? That's right here. So you can see that the typical use case that we're going to work through is a typical use case of this particular one. We're going to use about 5 commands, and how easy is it to do that? So just coming quickly into our. So many of you would have access to, let's say, Lab on Demand. You have to actually create a lab. It has to be published. And once it's published, I have this one particular lab, and this is the one that I want to launch via API. So in this case, to say, well, I need to get something. So how do I launch it? Do I launch it by name, by number? What is it that I actually need to launch with? So if I want to launch a lab, okay, it says that I need my particular lab ID. Okay, user ID, first name, last name. So if I come back over to Postman, okay, and because I downloaded the Open API, all of these are already predefined with examples. And so this is my lab ID. How do you find that? Very easily. If I'm on LOD, I can very easily search for a particular lab, and I can expose the actual internal ID of the lab. So this here is my lab ID. Come back to Postman, and then Postman, I would basically put in my lab ID, and I'm just going to set it up as myself. And let's say eric.grau@test.com. So I'm just running a very simple API call. All the rest of the parameters I'm just leaving as not used. And you see that Postman already fills in that line at the top. So this is my integration line that I would actually be doing. And I send this off, and what you see is that the result comes back. So it says that there's no error. Okay, I have a URL that's accessed, and I have a lab instance ID. Well, the lab instance ID, so every lab that's launched has a unique instance ID that is nowhere else except for that particular user, that particular instance of that lab for that user. So let's say what I wanted to do is say, well, I know I just launched the lab, and this lab happens to be a VM. I know that sometimes the labs take a while, and how do I find information about that particular lab? Well, here, if I have that lab instance ID, I can actually retrieve, sorry, not resume. So retrieve information about that lab. I can actually put my lab instance ID in, and now you can see that Eric Grau was the person that launched it, okay? And the state is building, okay? So what does that mean? That means it hasn't actually started yet. So it's in the building process. If I come back to the actual URL that was exposed and I open that up, I'll just wait for it to launch. Okay, so it's still building. I can't actually open that right now. So what you'll see is that as it's building, you'll have more information about this particular lab. So I can always rerun. So typically your calling program would continually run this until the lab is actually, the state is running. So the lab is still coming up and still initiating. So what else can I do? Well, once the lab is up and running, okay, what will actually happen is that you'll be able to save the lab. So I could actually save the lab instance. So once I put in the instance ID, I would save it, and then you would see that it would be saved, and then this would be the expired time that would be exposed to the user. So you'd have a lot. You can see that all of these tabs are a specific command in that whole workflow. So it becomes very straightforward of actually how to actually launch that lab. And while this is still building, let me just see if it's still in the process of building. It's starting. So it's not quite there yet. We're just about there. Okay, and okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to launch it, and you'll see it was on my other screen. I apologize. So my virtual machine is building. So all this is done through the API. All right. So imagine that I do this from the LMS. I can actually have a button, and I can just expose this particular command. And so in a very easy way, you're able to programmatically do that. Once that lab is actually finally launched, it will come up, and we'll be able to continue. What I'm going to do now is, while that is running, I don't want to waste our demo. Let's go over to the TMS, and let's start working on the TMS. We'll come back to this when the lab is actually up and running. So let's say on the TMS, I'm going to do something in this call now. I want to show you what's coming new. So what's coming new is a self-testing tool. So we also are going to be able to expose the testing tool, the try it functionality, right within our platform. So how do we do that? Well, now bear in mind, this is just soon to be released. So here we see our new, I have the TMS all set up to do a dry run of our testing. So what would it mean if I could actually have the testing right within the documentation? What are the benefits? So you saw before with Postman, I always have to switch back and forth and back and forth, and it becomes problematic. So it takes time. It's not impossible. And that's typically how most integrators work. They have a documentation that they refer to, and they go into Postman or some integration tool. But what if I could do everything all in one spot? Well, that's what's going to be released in a couple of weeks. So if we take a look at our TMS, and let's say I have a list of users. So I go back to that case I said where we have, let's say we've added 1,000 users into our system. And now I need to update or manage that, that user. How would I do that? How would I integrate that from an LMS? Well, let's say I wanted to retrieve a user by ID. So here you can see I have the different response examples. I can collapse and expand. What feature you also have here, this is a typical result. If I issue the command correctly, I can also expand and collapse all, so which is very powerful. So sometimes you only want to drill into the areas of interest. So if I'm just interested in the subsection, I can actually drill that out. So let's actually try this. So let's actually go through a valid test. So let's say I just put a number in at random, and I initiated the call, and now you can see that my all my parameters are listed here. My security key is here, the API key, all the parameters, and it says which ones are required, and this matches the documentation. So it says there's only one parameter that's required for this particular API. And come back to the result, and now you see that I get this status 20. Oh, I wish I had the documentation beside me. Well, lo and behold, bam, I've got the documentation right beside me and says, aha, this particular 20 this user is not found. So when I'm testing, I have full access to this and say, oh, maybe I just got the wrong ID. So let's try a valid ID. So I have a different valid ID. I come in, I resend, and now all of a sudden I have my user. So that's how powerful it is to have the testing right within the actual, right beside the actual information. So let's use this just a little bit further and expand on this just a little bit more. As I said, in this particular case, what I want to be able to do is be able to edit a user. And so how difficult is that? So let's say I wanted to update the external ID of a user. So external IDs, for those that are enterprise customers, they say, hey, I have 1,000 users in my organization, and I have them, I want to do, let's say, on-demand browsing, on-demand course catalogs. And so basically, I would set them up and import those 1,000 records into my TMS, and I can actually have them set up with courses and have them actually be able to be launched right from my LMS. Well, what if I needed to update information? So an external ID would be, how do I link my company ID with the internal ID in Skillable? So Skillable, whenever you create a user, it creates a unique ID independent. So you don't always know what that ID is. So let's say I wanted to do something like this. So typically I would come in and say, retrieve the user by email. So if I try it here, so Eric Route test, okay, and I come down and I find my Eric Route test. Great. Now I get the ID, the actual individual ID of my user. Here's my external ID. And as a corporate, I say, you know what, that's the wrong external ID. So when I retrieve my information, so typically what would happen is I would say, what's my customer ID? I want to put in the external customer ID I expect, and this is would match my CRM system or my content management system for my users. And I look, and lo and behold, I get that status 20 again. Status 20 again saying, hey, user's not found. Okay, so typically what that would mean is I need to update that user as we retrieved earlier. Okay, so I got the user by the email address. I have that ID, I can capture that ID, and now I come down and update the user by ID. So it's very straightforward. I can go back into the try it function again, and I can paste in the ID, okay, username, all the required fields are here, and I'm just going to update the particular external ID to my known set. Okay. So all I'm doing is updating the individual user. Okay. Okay. What happened? Okay. User cannot be moved to the specified organization. I messed something in my request. Okay. So what did I do? So guess what? I put the wrong field in. So so it's easy. So it gives you the complete validity of what you say. Well, I don't know what my organization ID is. Where did that come from? If you come back to when I retrieved the user from before, you notice that in this payload, you actually have the organization ID exposed. So it's very easy within the Connect tool now with the integrated testing. It remembers all the different results that you did from previous calls. Come back now to update the user, and now I can just copy and paste that in, and now I can actually resend it, okay? And then, now I've got other errors. What did I forget? Come in, and what I do is I found out, I say, that's right. I left some incorrect company or manager ID information. So now I resend one last time, and now I actually have a result. Now it doesn't give me anything back. Well, what does it return? If I now look at the result, then you would actually see that this particular call had a success. So that means it initiated the call without error. Well, how do I know if my ID got updated? And then it's very easy. Come back to retrieve information by external ID. I can come back into here. I can resend, and lo and behold, now you see I have everything integrated. Everything works. So this is a very, a very powerful way of actually how to show you how commands link together, how they work together, and how to use our new Connect, I'll say version 2 that's coming out in just a few weeks, to have integrated testing right alongside the documentation. So the whole goal is to keep your developers, to keep your integrators all looking at the information alongside of the documentation, which should reduce tremendous amount of time actually going through that process. And just bear with me one more time. Okay, you can see here, I said I would come back to the LOD. So here, and I'll just finish, and then we'll open up to Q&A. So our lab launched. Our lab is here. It's active. And if I come back to our Postman, so if I wanted to retrieve information, details about this lab again, just refresh. And if I come down, you see that the state is running, but it's not complete yet. Well, what if I wanted to save the lab remotely? So, so if I come over and make sure I have the right instance ID and come back and, retrieve and save the lab instance, what will happen to the user? The user's in the lab, okay? So there's no error, it's saving the lab. I come back over to the lab client. What's actually happening is it's automatically saving. So a lot of times you can actually do this maybe at the end of class to say, hey, save your work. And if you haven't submitted it on time, this the exam's ending, right? And so now you have a programmatic way to actually initiate that. Or maybe it's the end of the day and say, hey, we're at the end of the day, we're going to resume this first thing in the morning. And it's very easy to do. And as soon as this is saved, what we do is we come back over to here, and I can find details again about that particular lab. Okay, and what will happen? You'll see that the state is saving. So all of this is exposed in the JSON itself to actually show you, and it shows me that the student hasn't completed their exam. So that gives me the full access. Issue it one more time, and it's saved. What will happen at the user's end? They will actually see that the lab is ended. Okay, let's say I wanted to resume that lab. I could come back over to resume. I could resume the lab, and lo and behold, the lab client open here. Okay, and it's actually resuming the lab. And I'll just do one last thing to show you the scoring, and we'll open up to Q&A. So here it resumes the lab. Okay, once that lab is completed, I have multiple screens open. I apologize. Okay, so let's say I just put in my name, okay, and structure. So all I'm doing this, showing I'm going to submit for scoring. Okay, so I'm grading. I didn't answer everything, saying I don't know all the answers, just to show you a quick way of actually how do I use these APIs to get my scoring data? How easy is it to do? Well, once you have this completed, okay, it'll actually submit for grading. And if I come back quickly over to here and get me my information on the lab itself, which you'll actually see is it's going through a state of scoring. Scoring is another API call that I can say initiate scoring on a lab instance. So I can actually initiate that scoring remotely if I wanted to. And once this is done, okay, so it's tearing down. So what that means is that the score is complete. Okay, so the user would, it depends on how the lab is configured. You see that the user, did they pass? Yes, I passed. Well, how do I finish off with a result? And last but not least, I can actually retrieve, so the information in this case would be, it is complete, okay? And what I also want to do is retrieve the information. Give me a moment here. Okay, so it shows me that it's complete. Okay, and it also passes the exam score back. So, okay, so very powerful. So we have, and it would even show, if I set this up, all the details, all the extra features within that particular experience. So that's, so just coming back to our PowerPoint, and that's the end of the demo. And just bear with me as I So now we have any questions. Does anyone have any questions? I know I said we come back to questions. Sorry, the demo just took a little bit longer. Does anybody have any questions on the call? If you have any questions, you can just unmute yourself and ask away.
Hey, Eric. This is Mark Morrissey. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Sorry if there's a little echo. As this is released, will there be training available on it? We're going to be deploying an LMS, and certainly we want to be using the API calls with Skillable to automate some of the functions, but by no means am I an API developer. This looks pretty slick, but I'm sure I'd need some more hands-on. Is that something that's going to be available?
Well, when you connect with us, we also assign a kind of a customer success manager, an account executive that will actually work with you, and you can ask specific questions through them, also through our support. We'll have so as we're building our documentation out, we're going to be providing more and more information at some of our. So right now we're just documented all of our what I call the actual endpoints, the commands themselves. But you know, getting into further of how I actually demoed, or actually how to connect, or what to do. And oh, one thing I forgot to show, Mark, which is also shame on me. And just bear with me as I come over to here. Notice that on the try it functionality, I also have the ability to expose different programming languages. So depending on which particular program, we also give you the specific coding to further assist in you actually building out that integration. So a lot of times you say, that's great, I can see the raw command. So here's the raw command, but how do I actually do that in a program that I have to now integrate into my LMS? Then you can actually use these examples to actually provide that programming stub to actually perform that particular action. So that's one way to expose some of that interaction. Was that good, Mark?
That's great. It tells me I'm going to be hitting Bill up for some conversation.
Fantastic, fantastic. Anyone else have any other questions? Okay, excellent. Well, I wanted to thank everyone for this particular session. And also, we have a wonderful support team through our customer support channel, and the link is here. And we also have other resources. Okay, so the next session's in 15 minutes on the Q2 launch. Looking forward to complete your evaluation, please. And I hope you enjoyed the session. Please tag us on social media if you can. And also, you can also email questions or any questions you have. Sometimes you come up with questions after the fact. By all means, you can always send them in to events@skillable.com. And lastly, hang in for the end of the session, which will be Ask the Experts. I'll be joining again in there with all the other highly skilled, Skillable staff to answer any of your questions that come up during that time. So I want to say thank you, everyone, for your time today. Hope you learned something. Hope you're excited, and looking forward to a wonderful future with all of you. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.